Just to mention to everyone, there is interpretation from English to Spanish, and you'll find a button to switch to Spanish at the bottom of the screen. So welcome to our final webinar in a series titled Four Definitions to Change the World, where we've been focusing on key issues under scrutiny in the intergovernmental negotiations for a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. Over the last week, we have looked at the issues of harmful tax practices, foreseeable relevance, particularly within the operations of automatic exchange of information. And yesterday, we took a deeper dive into understanding different interpretations and perspectives of value creation and where that occurs. Following each of the speakers, the three speakers, we'll have a Q&A, and please use the Q&A function, which is also, I think, at the bottom of your screen. So as we go along, you can record your questions or indeed your observations. I'll introduce speakers in a moment. But just to say, today we've set ourselves the challenge of opening the lid a little bit on illicit financial flows. And we will, with our excellent panel, try and surface the importance of this issue and how international cooperation can rise to the challenge and how the Framework Convention could be transformative in its influence on tax avoidance, tax evasion, and the harmful tax practices that lie at the core of global tax justice debates. So I just want to say a few introductory comments to settle us into what I think will be a really interesting discussion. Last week, I was at a conference looking at financial flows, at foreign direct investment flows, and not surprising to hear that jurisdictional arbitrage that facilitates intergroup trade is estimated at about 50% of all global trade. So that might be a low estimate, it might be a little bit high, but assuming that's the case. And usual suspects are at the heart of this activity. And this scale of extraction goes, I think, to the heart of the resolution that which was first presented to the UN General Assembly in 2022. So intergroup structures and jurisdictional arbitrage is not the focus of our discussion today, but it is a crucial element of understanding one of the challenges facing international cooperation and puts into perspective both the determination and the ambition set out in the Framework Convention's terms of reference, including a reference adopted at the General Assembly in 2022, which was about combating illicit financial flows as an essential development challenge, and noting that developing countries are particularly susceptible to the negative impact of illicit financial flows. As a framing for this discussion, we might think of the Framework Convention as a framework convention on illicit financial flows in itself. And if that were the case, what should Article 7 include? How should the commitment be expressed? So during the negotiations, we have observed a dynamic of ambition, interventions pushing for a more operational, justice-orientated commitment. The African group linking cooperation to tools for detection and ensuring taxation is applied by jurisdictions from which flows originate, and for provisions that prevent jurisdictions from serving as safe havens, and for coordinated global standards. And others, including from civil society, setting out in their interventions the need for legally binding obligations, country by country reporting, a global asset registry, and so on. At the same time, other countries, global north countries, have prioritised a need for definitional clarity, concerns about including tax avoidance under illicit. And we will touch on the issue of definition during the course of the webinar. So I'd like to now just introduce our three speakers and the running order. So first we're going to hear from Dr. Jamal Ibrahim, who's an economist, chief at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And within his role at DESA was supporting the FACTI panel in the production of a report on the a high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda. We'll then have a hopefully a 2-minute video clip, a short clip, which is going to focus on the idea of definition. Before we turn to then Chenai Makumba, who before becoming the executive director at the Tax Justice Network Africa, Chenai joined first as a policy research and advocacy manager, but she's also got extensive expertise and experience in international trade and African economic governance. And finally, we've got Alex Cobham. Alex is an economist and is also the Chief Executive Officer here at the Tax Justice Network. So, Jamal, I just wanted to first to turn to you and just a reminder to all the speakers, and hopefully I've paid attention to this, to speak as slowly as possible. But Jamal, turning to you first and hoping you can share with us something of the historical context of illicit financial flows, and in particular how African political leadership has developed and influenced the nature of the debate and the progress to develop a meaningful counter to illicit financial flows. So I'm going to hand the floor over to you, Jamal.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you to Tax Justice Network. And I'm glad that I'll be here with colleagues and old friends, Alex and Chenai. Probably they've been hearing what I'm saying for over a decade or so. I saw that Alex had a very nice trick. He had some coffee with him so that he won't get asleep. I'm not sure about Chenai. Probably you need to get your coffee because it's the next 10, 15 minutes. You'll be hearing probably repeatedly what I've been saying. Can I share the screen? Please, I have a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. Please do.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Can, yes.
Oh, okay. And I think you can hear me well, Liz. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Okay. So I think in response to your question, Liz, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about three interconnected things. You see, the African leadership in terms of shaping the discussion and efforts on illicit financial flows since what we call the Mbeki report, which is the ECA African Union high-level panel report, which was established by the African Ministers of Finance in 2011. And then the evolution of efforts from the Mbeki report to the FACTI panel, which you mentioned, which took the discussion, the same perspective from an African perspective to a global one. And then to the what you started the discussion with the Article 7 of the UN Framework Convention. And the debate in terms of the negotiations, I think there are three core issues. First one is how we define illicit financial flows, and I'm going to talk about two perspectives to the definition. And this is very important because as part of Article 7, it's really important to see how does the international community define tax-related illicit financial flows, because it's a main sticky point. Number two is how the international community as well reach concrete commitments to combat these flows. And number three is addressing the root causes of the problem, is whether the convention will tackle the structural drivers of revenue losses in developing countries. And then based on these three questions, I'll start with the Mbeki panel, the African AU-ACA high-level panel, which was led by the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. Am I okay in terms of from the interpreter's perspective, or or do I need to slow down?
No, I think that's fine, Jamal. I'm not sure that your slides are moving on. Do just
Really?
check.
Oh,
You're showing us the first slide.
this is strange because they're moving here. I don't know what
Okay.
to do.
Uh,
Can you show them from your side
I
then?
think you're sharing the PowerPoint rather than sharing the slideshow. So perhaps if you stop sharing and then share again, but share the actual slideshow.
Is this better now? No? You say the screen is sharing.
We're seeing slide 2 now.
Yes, so it's fine, yeah?
yeah.
Okay.
So I was in here. Can you see slide 3?
Yes. Yeah.
So I was saying that the high-level panel established in 2011 by the African Ministers of Finance. The flows are not just criminal justice problem. I think that was the turning point in terms of the definition, because when the panel started, they focus on three issues. One, that this is not just a technical issue, it's a development issue. It affects domestic resource mobilization, the debt architecture. It affects the financing development landscape. So these leakages are really, really important, for efforts to spend on health, education, etc. So first, it highlights that this is a development issue. Second, it highlights that this is a governance issue. The main debate I remember when the panel started, that in the literature it was dominated, apart from some discussions within civil society on illicit financial flows, the discussion was dominated by capital flight. They're looking at this. And if you look at the governance issue of capital flight, then it mainly focused on developing countries, that there is a problem of business environment, macroeconomic environment, etc. And the focus was on these new liberal policies in terms of helping countries to get the business environment right so investors can come in. It moves the discussion that this is not a developing countries problem, but there is a destination of these flows. And I think that was a very important part, that this money goes somewhere, and that was not part of the discussion. All these secrecy issues that Alex and Shinai's colleagues, and so we're talking about, we're not part of the discussion. So the panel brought that this is an origin and destination, and then this is it's an African problem, but with a global solution. The third part of I think the discussion is that it needs a broad definition, because the focus was on criminal activities, and you can see here on the right, the panel said commercial activities is tax related with 65%, criminal activities is 35%, and 5% only for corruption. And by that time, I think most of the donors were looking at the issue of corruption because it was a developing country's problem. So a broad definition, particularly in terms of tax and issues of aggressive tax avoidance. And this is very important, I think, for me when we go ahead with the presentation. This had a lasting influence because a broader framework has influenced several global and regional processes. You know, for us in Africa, it affected the African Union Agenda 2063, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, the SDGs, and it was, you see, you rarely hear this, you know, the mention of capital flight in Addis Ababa Action Agenda or in Sevilla or so. And then a very important turning point was the Conference of Ministers of Finance in May 2022. They've asked the UN to start negotiation on the UN tax convention that was picked up by the Africa Group in New York, and you know the rest in terms of the UN tax convention. So this actually, I think it influences some of the slides talking about how the Mbeki panel plays a foundational role in reshaping the IFF debate. So quickly, the FACTI panel, which was established by the President of the UN General Assembly and the President of the Economic and Social Council in 2020, took this one step in terms of looking at the issue from the global perspective, looking at the objective is to contribute to global efforts to implement the 2030 SDG agenda, and saying that based on the definition and the view of the high-level panel, the FACTI panel wanted to look at the challenges in terms of financial accountability, transparency, and integrity at the different parts of illicit financial flows, in terms of tax-related, corruption, and criminal activities, as interconnected and interlinked together, and then the return from the asset should be spent on the SDGs activities. So the key findings, very quickly, establish an inclusive global coordination mechanism at ECOSOC to address financial integrity, create an inclusive intergovernmental body on tax matters under the UN, which actually led to the UN Tax Convention. And then in terms of the FATF work in terms of money laundering and the UNCTAD, a conference of parties on corruption, they all be part of a coordinated mechanism under the ECOSOC. So the framework convention, based on this foundation of both the high-level panel on illicit financial flows and the FACTI panel, I just wanted to highlight a couple of slides. First, that's a framework convention has seen a technical shift from identifying problems to defining solutions. So what I call here the issue from information gaps to operational commitments. So in the discussions in August and December 2025, the focus by African developing countries was mainly on emphasizing the issue of the access of information. I think you discussed this, Liz, you said in one of the previous webinar. Lack of access of information or offshore income, hidden assets and ownership structure. And as this issue in terms of transparency is very, very important. But what's really, really important, if you identify the perspective, as I said, from this broad perspective, is that transparency is not just important in terms of understanding it, but in terms of how you tackle it. So there was a shift now in February 2026. If you can see, the draft introduced more concrete commitments, marking a shift from just broad principles towards a very important point, which is the operationalization, operational architecture for how to detect them, how to report, and how to share the information. The second important point here, so here I think it's what I wanted to highlight is that transparency is important, but accountability is very, very important. And I think the discussion in February 2026 about what I said in terms of, you know, how to detect, how to report, and how to share the information in a global architecture which is fair and which can respond to the needs of developing countries. So the issue of accountability, this is what was something that I really need to take. And I think probably we can discuss this you know, later in the discussions. So based on this, I will come now to that in terms of the negotiation. There are two competing visions for Article 7. And I don't think that, all of you probably agree with me, these are not new. So the current negotiation revealed two different approaches. And these two different approaches has been there, you know, since the start of the discussions that I was talking about for the last decades, mainly in terms of tax related. There is a narrow legalistic approach borne by many developing countries. And here, I think the main point is that they wanted to reopen the debate on the definition, because the member states have agreed under the statistical commission to have a definition of illicit financial flows, which is the broad definition. And then they've asked UNCTAD and UNODC to lead in terms of the various methods in terms of how you measure them. But the issue was closed in terms of how you define illicit financial flows in terms of the broad definition. But there was this attempts to restrict the scope to strictly, again, illegal activities. And for you who have been following the discussions, you know, I'm going to talk now about the broader development-oriented, you know, developing countries insisted that we should not reopen the debate. So based on this, again, they prioritize legal certainty based on criminal activities, etc. Caution against any sort of broad operational commitments, and view tax avoidance and IFF as separate issues. So a broader definition championed by African and other developing countries insisted that you should stick to the definition by member states, which include aggressive tax avoidance, address structural tax leakages and harmful financial practices, because the problem, if we just follow the legal, this legalistic approach, is that they wanted just to preserve the status quo and talk about the symptoms, not the structural problems within the governance architecture. And this is similar to someone, if you went to the doctor, you know, we're having a fever, they just give you a paracetamol to, you know, for a fever or headache or so. But they don't go and see what is the cause in terms of the whole body, Was this something coming from urinary tract infection? Is it a stomach? Is it something related to, you look at the structural problem. So they're trying to avoid this and looking at the symptoms and restrict this view, which want to look at the structural issues. So if you look at the structural issues, then the second point is establish very strong operational commitments. You agreed on the definition on what you need to do, and now you need to lock it in terms of committing to it. And finally, as I said, it's a development-oriented focus. So in this discussion, then I think this echoes the African Union ECA panel. The current African proposals are not new, but continuation of recommendation advanced by the Mbeki panel. If you look at the key areas of alignment in terms of beneficial ownership, automatic exchange of information, country-by-country reporting, transfer pricing, tax treaties, and strong interagency coordination. So there are two key issues before I end. Do I have time, Liz, for just quick 3 slides?
Yes, please. Yeah, do please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the key first key issue from development perspectives and the African negotiators is the first core is the right to tax as a source. So this is an issue of economic sovereignty. African countries stress that taxing rights should remain with the jurisdiction where economic activities and value creation occur. So the Africa Group proposes that taxes on IFF should be applied by the jurisdiction from which these flows originate. So this principle directly addresses the long-standing concerns about profit shifting, treaty abuse, and erosion of source country tax base. So this is mainly, as I said, an economic sovereignty issue. The second issue is ending financial secrecy. So the proposals for beneficial ownership transparency and mandatory information exchange have become central operational pillars now. This recognizes that modern IFF are frequently facilitated by OPICO corporate structure. So back again, this is why I highlighted that there is a need to not just focus on transparency, but focus on accountability in terms of shell entities, those companies with no real operation used to disguise ownership, offshore vehicles, and nominee ownership using third parties to obscure the true owners of an asset. So in terms of finally here, my last slide is on recommendations. So IFF, these flows are, and from an African perspective, it's an African problem is a global solution, as the Mbeki panel advocated. The destination of these flows and the global systems that enable them must be addressed through concerted international action. So these are just a few recommendations in terms of the global architecture and transparency, the need to eliminate secrecy jurisdictions, universal automatic information exchange. There should be a push for a global standard of automatic exchange of tax information that includes African nations. Very important to have a global country-by-country reporting, and I think you've discussed this in your previous webinars. So all multinationals to publicly report their financial information on country-by-country, and public registries of beneficial ownership. And in terms of cooperation and repatriation, support capacity building. This is in terms of, the decline in ODA or so. We see now more support now from donors to issues of criminal activities. And there is an issue of less, you can now even talk from our perspective here, is here less, and Shinai can probably elaborate on this, is that less money now going to issues of tax-related support to help African countries to build the capacity to tackle IFF, tax information, tax administration, tax policy, expedite asset recovery, streamline the process for tracing and freezing and repatriating stolen assets. And this is one of the main issues. I think we've been following this in terms of our member states. Only Nigeria actually managed to do this, Angola for a while. I've been advocating on that, but there's never been a champion on this, because this is a global issue. Someone who can just discuss with the other side of the equation, because we have less in Africa, less specialists in terms of lawyers and accountants and so who are specialized in these areas. Incorporate IFF in development agenda, ensures that curbing IFF is a central target in the post-2030 development agenda. So thank you. I hope that I've just highlighted the main points, the discussion, how it evolved, the main issues that the African negotiators are focused on, and the need to have strong commitments on illicit financial flows in terms of issues, to make sure that we have a fair international global architecture. And then second, in terms of strong commitments from member states, both Africans and in developed countries, to address illicit financial flows as a systemic issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamal. That was really excellent in terms of just the history and how it's developed, and it's also really interesting to think about where we are now and the discussions we've been in, how we're there's a group of countries that we're still kind of dancing around definition and the more profound issues around economic sovereignty, the legitimacy that comes with transparency and the whole governance of corporations is so pertinent and present and yet to be addressed. But that was really, really excellent. The point on definition, we just wanted to highlight a video that a small clip that was from, I think, the November 3rd session of the UN discussions. So we're just going to play this, and then we're going to, and we can come back to that in the idea of discussion, but we will then move on to you, Chennai. So I think my colleague Helena is going to play this short clip for us. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Chair. Our intervention is on a limited point on the topic that we have discussed earlier this week on the illicit financial flows, which we termed as a definition is an elephant in the room. So we would like to draw the attention of the Chair and Member States to the, in this regard, to the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. The United Nations has a formal statistical definition of in the illicit financial flows, and it includes a specific category of illicit financial flows related to tax as well. So let me draw the attention of the member states to a brief background on this topic. the UN General Assembly gave the mandate of developing Sustainable Development Goal indicators to UN Statistical Commission through a UN General Assembly resolution. The Sustainable Development Goals indicators are basically the indicators that are used to measure the progress on the targets under the Sustainable Development Goal 2030. One of the indicator being illicit financial flows as per 16.4.1 indicator. So, and further, 2 UN bodies have been appointed as custodian to develop a conceptual framework for measurement of these illicit financial flows. This document developed by these bodies was also endorsed later by the UN Statistical Commission in its 53rd session. And this definition includes tax avoidance being recognized as an illicit financial flow. So thus broadly, the UN and the member states have recognized under the SDG framework that illicit flows can also be generated from legal economic activities through aggressive tax avoidance. This can take place through manipulation of transfer pricing, strategic location of debt and intellectual property, tax treaty shopping, and use of hybrid instruments and entities, so on and so forth. So in this regard, India likes to put it a point out there that a good starting point for defining illicit financial flows is the conceptual framework for measurement of illicit financial flows developed by UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena, for showing us that. I think what it does is just really underline some of the points that you were making, Jamal, and you know, before the negotiations, the intergovernmental negotiations happened, that statistical definition was in place, and therefore that is the point that we need to start from. Chennai, can I turn to you and ask you from a regional perspective about issues of the impact of illicit financial flows on the issues that the region has to grapple with around sovereignty and capacity, and of course, if there's anything that you particularly wanted to respond to, Jamal, do so as well. But the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I think it's a particularly important conversation because, you know, these discussions are happening at a time not only where member states are currently preparing for the negotiations in August, so very specific, right, to the current discussions that are happening on the global tax system. But they are also happening, these conversations, at a time where we're witnessing particular strain, right, in multilateral governance much more broadly. And so I think any kind of space that allows for discussions that seek to strengthen multilateral governance conversations is really, really welcome. And so thank you for the invitation. So this particular webinar, I think, is important because it asks us to question some of the discussions that are around the questions of inclusivity, the questions of sovereignty, as well as the questions of fairness, which is something that's been debated quite a bit during the discussions. Now, the conversation we're having today around illicit financial flows is particularly important because IFFs, in many ways, are not just a technical conversation, but as alluded to in response to the question that you've just given me, also an incredibly developmental conversation as well. And this is in large part why the Africa Group championed this cause in 2022, and as was mentioned by Jamal, had been championing this cause for many, many years. For African countries, illicit financial flows undermines not only domestic revenue mobilization, but also erodes state capacity, weakens public trust, right? So undermining the social contract, constrains government's ability to finance developmental priorities, as was mentioned by Jamal. And this is particularly important when you think about the current moment within which we find ourselves today. Again, Jamal also mentioned this, right? We are seeing a decline in overseas development assistance, Many African countries are currently facing debt distress or the threat of debt distress. Many African countries are also finding themselves susceptible to climate vulnerability. They're also experiencing fiscal consolidation pressures, also witnessing rising inequalities, and the continued loss of resources through tax abuse, tax avoidance, and tax-related illicit financial flows is simply unsustainable. And so, in response to the first question that you asked me, right, can I talk about the distinctive importance of the convention as an instrument to curb illicit financial flows? The convention is important because it seeks to address a couple of things. First, it seeks to address a long-standing governance gap that we've had in the international tax system. Jamal made mention to the high-level panel report that was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. And this was one of the fundamental points that this report flagged, that historically, international tax rules had been developed and were being developed through institutions such as the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank. But in many of these institutions, African countries did not have substantive roles to play as far as decision-making was concerned. Since the 1960s, the OECD particularly was the dominant rule-setting institution in international tax governance. Despite the fact that African countries were not members of this, and even when the OECD was then expanded into the inclusive framework as well, noted that African countries themselves still continue to have limited participation within the inclusive framework. And so the question of governance is one that the convention seeks to answer as far as illicit financial flows are concerned. And their participation is important because ultimately they need to be at the table as far as agenda setting is concerned. And so this is precisely why many developing countries pushed for a universal intergovernmental process under the United Nations, a forum where all countries would be able to participate on an equal footing in shaping international tax cooperation. Now, this matters greatly for issues such as illicit financial flows because the effects of international tax rules are not neutral, right? They directly shape tax sovereignty, fiscal space, and developmental trajectories, which Jamal made a really great point around. And I think it's also important to indicate that illicit financial flows are ultimately part of the reason that many African countries find themselves not being able to achieve their developmental trajectories. Having said that, I do want to note that whilst we're talking about illicit financial flows from an international perspective, a lot of the pushback that we often get when talking about this is that, is this not just a domestic issue? And I know Jamal made reference to the way in which illicit financial flows used to be framed earlier. I make this point because there has been significant work by African countries to address the illicit financial flows on the continent. And this was one of the things that the high-level panel report flagged in talking about ways in which we could address this. And so across the continent, we've seen governments strengthening their domestic tax systems, improving beneficial ownership frameworks, enhancing anti-money laundering mechanisms. And we've seen institutions such as ATAF, the ECA, the Africa Union come together in order to support these efforts. However, as was mentioned also previously, domestic efforts at addressing illicit financial flows are not sufficient. And so subsequently, that is one of the primary gaps that the UN Framework Convention looks to addressing. The second is that the convention also provides an opportunity to move beyond fragmented approaches to tackling illicit financial flows. Right now, the international architecture that seeks to address IFFs is highly fragmented. It's spread across tax cooperation frameworks, anti-money laundering systems, anti-corruption instruments, bilateral treaties, voluntary transparency initiatives. But one of the things that the Framework Convention tries to do is consolidate all of these conversations under the UN. The convention creates an opportunity to establish a coherent, high-level framework that's linking together issues such as transparency, information exchange, taxation of M&Es, beneficial ownership, etc. And so in other words, what it helps us try to do is move beyond addressing the symptoms piecemeal, but rather try to address the issues of illicit financial flows systematically, looking at the structural drivers of illicit financial flows under one umbrella. It also helps us take a less fragmented approach to dealing with IFFs. And so the convention presents an opportunity to move beyond these fragmented approaches by establishing this coherent framework to help us establish common standards for transparency, etc. And not only does it essentially create these, but it provides all countries to be able to participate in the development of these standards. And so particularly for developing countries, it allows them to participate in the development of rules and standards that are cognizant of some of the constraints that they face in their respective jurisdictions. And so the second question that I was asked to look at is essentially what are some of the commitments and language that we think are particularly important as these negotiations are moving forward. First and foremost, we feel that the convention needs to establish concrete obligations rather than broad principles that don't have sufficient implementation mechanisms. Soft law approaches have dominated international tax governance for decades. Many international tax standards rely heavily on voluntary compliance, political goodwill, and peer pressure rather than binding obligations. And the result is that often we've seen uneven implementation, limited accountability, and continued opportunities for tax abuse and profit shifting. And so part of what we want to see in the convention in order for it to succeed is the inclusion of binding obligations, clear implementation timelines, monitoring and review mechanisms, accountability structures, and meaningful support for implementation in developing countries. Otherwise, there's a very real risk that we will reproduce the limitation of previous initiatives. One particularly important issue in the negotiations has been Article 5 on the fair allocation of taxing rights. And this is fundamentally about tax sovereignty. African countries have consistently argued that multinational enterprises should pay taxes where real economic activity occurs, where value is created, where revenue is generated, where users and markets are located, and where resources are extracted. And this is especially important in the digitalized economy, where companies can derive enormous profits from jurisdictions without maintaining a physical presence there. And we've seen this being championed by the Africa Group with proposals led by Zambia, for example. This is a major shift from some of the outdated international tax rules that have excessively privileged residence jurisdictions over source jurisdictions. And so the convention should also support the review and the renegotiation of existing tax treaties that unfairly restrict the taxing rights of developing countries. Another critical issue that is particularly important as far as IFS is concerned is that of tax transparency. The convention should contain strong and binding commitments on beneficial ownership so that individuals can't hide behind anonymous companies, trusts, and opaque legal structures. It's also essential not only for combating tax evasion, but for many other issues that influence illicit financial flows. Importantly, country-by-country reporting is also one that should become a standalone commitment within the convention, as it's simply not a technical reporting mechanism, but foundational to a fairer international tax system. Importantly, public country-by-country reporting also lays the groundwork for ambitious reforms in the future, including conversations around potentially exploring unitary taxation and formulary apportionment. As I conclude, allow me to add just a few more comments. One of the interesting proposals that was raised by the Africa Group during the negotiations was namely the proposal that sought to link illicit financial flows to be taxable in the jurisdiction from where they originated. And this was something that Jamal mentioned. This is a particularly significant proposal because it moves beyond simply recovering stolen assets or prosecuting crimes after the fact. It recognizes that countries should also retain fiscal rights over income that's been generated through this activity within their jurisdictions. And importantly, this approach already exists in some domestic systems, including countries such as Ireland and the United States, where taxation has sometimes proven even more effective than criminal prosecution alone. Ultimately, the stakes in these negotiations are extremely high, and this convention is simply not one that we need to look past. It's about whether developing countries, particularly African countries, can secure a more equitable place within the global economic system. It's also about issues pertaining to supporting sustainable development, as well as democratic accountability and fiscal sovereignty. And it's also about multilateralism and how it can evolve to become much more universal, more representative, and more responsive to some of the contemporary global realities that we're confronted with today. Thank you, Liz.
Super, thanks, Chennai. Gosh, you've covered such a range of things about both the mechanics and the governance. Interesting to hear about the fragmentation and insufficiency of existing instruments and so on. So I think we'll come back, and I think there'll be questions for you about that, and really interesting to think about that taxing of IFFs as a recovery instrument. But anyway, let's kind of come back to that. I've already seen some questions coming in, which I think we'll speak to those points. Alex, turn to you, and I think you also have a presentation.
I do. Thanks, Liz. Look, I have to say my presentation, I'd sort of prepared to be able to pick up anything that was sort of missing from the discussion, but following, as I should have known, to such experts in this space who are so steeped in this work, I kind of feel like there's a lot that I don't need to say. So perhaps I'll try and keep my remarks reasonably short so we can get into those questions and answers. And so let me just flick through and really just pick out a couple of the points here. One thing just for context, and I am contractually obliged to show a slide of this sort. This matters, the sorts of losses that we suffer from cross-border tax abuse. As we've heard, the biggest component of illicit financial flows are life-changing, indeed life-saving in very significant numbers, whichever way we cut them, and whether we think about the lost investments in public health or education, the improvements in governance that don't happen because these tax revenues are not raised, the impacts are dramatic. So I want to talk about kind of three pieces, but each of which have been touched on in different ways. Firstly, the kind of underlying narrative, the importance of the rise of the framing of illicit financial flows, as opposed to the old framing around corruption, why that matters, and also why it provoked such a backlash from particularly OECD countries and corporate lobbyists. Second, to look at the global agreement that we actually do have on illicit financial flows, and which we heard from the Indian delegate, not least on what exactly is in place, but including what's in place within the terms of reference for the UN Convention. What is the existing commitment to address this? In order then to look lastly at what the implications might be. And here again, I'll really echo a lot of points that Jamal and Chennai have already made. So in terms of this point on corruption, the line from the Mbeki report that illicit financial flows are an African problem requiring a global solution. I mean, this is true, but it's also true that illicit financial flows are a global problem. There is no country in the world that does not suffer significant cross-border tax abuse, other than a very small handful of the worst perpetrators of that abuse. And what that means is that the African group's leadership of this issue over more than a decade now, 15 years certainly, is a global public good. The benefits of this, including the benefits of leading us to the position that we are negotiating a UN framework convention, are shared by everyone because this is a global problem. And I think we need to recognize over and again just how much the African group has given and is giving the world in providing leadership on this issue. The kind of immediate gain from the report of the African Union ECA high-level panel was the adoption in 2015 of Sustainable Development Goal 16.4.1, the first and still only global goal to curb illicit financial flows. And as we've heard, with tax avoidance, not only tax evasion, specifically identified indeed as a major component of illicit flows. But the pushback to that was very strong, and it reflected the previous dominant narrative, the one that you see in the Corruption Perceptions Index, for example, where roughly 80% of the variation in that index is simply attributable to per capita income. So this idea that was very heavily embedded, particularly through the 1990s, that corruption is somehow a problem of poor countries and poor people, and that the solution to it is therefore things that poor countries need to do. This is kind of a classic case, paradigmatic case of blaming the victim, but it is really what drove this agenda for decades. And the illicit flows reinterpretation, understanding that the key actors were actually a combination of the failures of international tax rules dominated by countries in the global north and economic actors from the global north, including wealthy individuals, financial institutions, and above all, multinational companies, really put this on its head, but of course provoked pretty serious pushback from those who felt that their interests were under attack in this framing, whereas in the corruption framing, they'd been able to stay almost literally in the shadows. And so this pushback, as soon as we had the global agreement on SDG 16.4.1, was to say, no, we didn't mean that. That wasn't what we agreed to. This should only cover illegal flows and certainly not corporate tax avoidance. But of course, that's not what the Mbeki panel found, and it's not what was the basis of the global agreement. This figure that we'd actually prepared in background work for the panel and was taken into the report gives you a sense of these four different types of illicit financial flows, and you can characterize them according to the origin of the capital, where it's pretty easy to see if it's strictly illegal or not, but also the type of flow involved, where we're in more of a gray area. Is it illicit? Could be illegal, sometimes isn't necessarily. And what you see is that the pushback came really from people who were quite comfortable looking at the things in the top right quadrant of this diagram, where the capital is illegal in origin. So it's the proceeds of crime, or it's abuses of power, it's the theft of state assets. And that's what the old corruption agenda was happy to look at. But as soon as we include market and regulatory abuses and tax abuse, and we're often dealing then with capital which is legal in origin, but through the flows that cross border, it becomes illegal and or illicit. There, and where the actors are, of course, overwhelmingly from the global north, there is a great discomfort. And that really led to this prolonged attempt to subvert the definition of the agreed Sustainable Development Goal. And is something I presented at the UN at a session in 2017. This idea of multinationals telling campaigners and policymakers from the South that they've got the wrong target and they should be looking internally at corruption rather than thinking externally about illicit financial flows. But of course, when you do that, you undermine the agenda. The point of the illicit flows agenda is to re-establish the potential for effective direct taxation of income, profits, capital, that so often, through crossing borders or having its ownership hidden across borders, results in the failures of direct taxation in countries with direct impacts for people in those countries, not least, as this slide from Akina Manuel Africa shows, increases in gender inequality because of the inability of the tax system to function effectively. But notwithstanding that pushback, we did reach global agreement, both in terms of the definition, as we've heard, adopted by the United Nations, including through the General Assembly, despite what you hear from still some of the Global North delegates in the negotiations, the idea that this is still an open question. It's not. It is a question that the UN has comprehensively answered with the agreement of the General Assembly. And that underpins now the work in the convention. So it took 5 years, but we have a formal statistical definition of illicit financial flows. Financial flows that are illicit in origin, transfer, or use, of any of these, that reflect an exchange of value and that cross country borders. So really very specific and broken down helpfully in that same UN document into these components, which you'll notice are very closely related to the components that were proposed in the report of the high-level panel. And I've circled in red aggressive tax avoidance, just to make very clear that this is in there, and as the Mbeki panel said, a major component. And so that underpins the references to illicit financial flows that we find in the terms of reference, the globally agreed terms of reference for the UN Convention negotiations. Indeed, it's there almost in the first substantive paragraph of the preamble of that terms of reference, calling on for measures so that governments may better cooperate, including through combating illicit financial flows, recovering and returning stolen assets. So this is firmly established from the outset in the agreed terms of reference. But it's also referred to several further times. Again, these are from the preamble, and it's specifically calling out the work of the African Union and other Pan-African institutions, including the ECA, in, quote, promoting international cooperation to fight illicit financial flows and recognizing the agreement in the Sustainable Development Goals. Although there it does slightly collapse back a little bit to emphasizing tax evasion and corruption. But we have the definition. We know avoidance is the central element. Okay, and then when we come to action, the specific call in the terms of reference is very clear that the Intergovernmental Committee, in elaborating the convention, should consider an early protocol on measures against tax-related illicit financial flows. Now, in the end, as we know, it was decided not to move ahead with an early protocol on this area as the negotiations evolved. But this specific element clearly is identified as important over and above others, and that reflects its prominence in the preamble. So we have a very strong basis on which to see illicit financial flows explicitly addressed in the convention. And that's why when we have the first draft from the co-chairs in January of this year, Article 7 is dedicated to illicit financial flows, albeit, and I'll come back to this, it's in relatively high-level language, as most of the convention is. And there's really just a question about how much further it might be useful to take that. Beyond that, of course, and I think Liz touched on this in opening things, with the formal statistical definition of illicit financial flows that had been agreed by the United Nations and the General Assembly, we have, in fact, a framing that allows us to say that this whole convention really is a convention on illicit financial flows. There is no aspect of this that isn't fundamentally about challenging illicit financial flows. We see that through the conceptual substance, through the key measures for transparency and cooperation that are being identified in the negotiations of the convention. And ultimately, we'll see that in the governance. The framework body to make this place and the subsidiaries will be bodies that are addressing illicit financial flows. And so we might almost say, look, all of this is there being covered. How much more do we actually need the convention to address specific details? But I think as we've already heard, there is a very strong case for it to do so. So let me finish by touching on just some of the implications that may be there for the negotiations. In terms of the opportunities, I think if you're here, you know that the framework that's being created for the first ever globally inclusive body to set the rules on international tax cooperation is an unprecedented and enormous opportunity. But there are specific opportunities as well, including and not only within Article 7, for us to move forward the agenda on illicit financial flows. The first of these, and this was proposed by our colleague Bob Michel here, is simply to look at the title of the article and consider changing that. So the title as it stands in the co-lead's draft is Tax-Related Illicit Financial Flows, Tax Avoidance and Tax Evasion. Now, it's very welcome to call out avoidance specifically, but the risk with that title is it seems to imply that avoidance and evasion are not the same thing or are not included within illicit financial flows. And as discussed, I think we'd want to push back on any suggestion of that. So the alternative would simply be to switch one word and have the title of the article be Tax-Related Illicit Financial Flows, including evasion and avoidance. Looking at the content and a bit more of the substance, we can also think of some proposals we might make. And again, Chennai and Jamal have both spoken to this already. As it stands, the article, although it's high level and relatively brief, is actually quite specific in calling out the need for effective tools for the detection and prevention of tax-related illicit financial flows. There are two in particular that it feels it would be extremely useful to name in this document. The convention isn't going to give us all of the substantive detail. It's not going to negotiate the detailed technical arrangements for particular measures, but it can make their subsequent adoption by the Conference of the Parties inevitable by specifying them. And I think that's what we should be looking at here. So if we think about those effective tools for detection and prevention, there's really two main elements. And we've heard both of these already today. One is around identifying the ultimate beneficial owner of any company, trust, partnership, any legal vehicle that can hide ownership of assets and income streams. And that really requires us to include a global asset register as an aspiration to be achieved by the framework body. And then secondly, looking at the corporate side, it's a global agreement for public country-by-country reporting so that we know for every multinational company the location of its real economic activity and how that compares to the location of its declared profits and its paid tax. Things that could be mentioned with relatively little work, but simply to ensure that the future framework body takes these forward. A couple more and I'll finish. One, to specify avoidance, just because a lot of the convention text as it stands could be interpreted only in terms of the legalities that relate to evasion. And we know that there are certain countries that are actively interested in promoting avoidance. And so it would be including in the text something on the lines of developing universal anti-avoidance rules and application frameworks. Again, Bob Michel has identified this as an idea, and it seems worth adopting to make clear that the convention will address avoidance throughout. Lastly, and perhaps going a bit further, but recognizing that the preamble starts with a reference to the recovery of stolen assets, there is a question about the recovery of stolen tax revenues and taxing rights. We know that tax and tax abuse have been central over centuries to the extraction processes from the global south. And the convention will include cooperation to recover certainly current legal or illegal tax debts and likely stolen assets. But there's a question. What about cooperation to enable reparative justice for historic tax abuse? If we're only limiting ourselves to tax evasion, lots of countries' laws have statutes of limitation where beyond a certain point in time, it's not possible to go back. But given that we are framing this to include avoidance, no such statute likely binds us. And certainly if we're thinking about reparative justice, it shouldn't. And so is there a space within the framework body to create the conditions for the future conference of the parties to revisit questions of reparative justice, including these centuries of extractive tax practices? I leave that as a question and finish there. Sorry if I've spoken too long. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Alex. Again, covered a lot of ground, and I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, and maybe in the composition of the panel and the things we're saying, I think there's a lot of commonality and agreement. We have got some questions, but I'm kind of curious. I just wanted to maybe give Jamal and Chennai an opportunity perhaps to respond. I mean, particularly to the latter part of your presentation, Alex, and you talking about, you know, what could be in Article 7, as well as particular policy measures that you're being specific about those, but also, you know, thinking about how it's framed as it within the language and the title, and also the question of how dealing with extraction and the issues of reparation. So Jamal, Chennai, I don't know if either of you would like to respond to that, or if there was anything else that you felt worthy of adding. Chennai, can I go to you first? See if there's.
Yeah, I think Alex, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's one worth exploring, right? Because I think it is important to be thinking about the way in which we, at least from an African perspective, you know, can use various tools to start thinking about the way in which they can contribute to reparative justice. And I think what you propose is quite an interesting idea that I think would be worth exploring. The extent to which it would find feet, I think, within the current negotiations, I think that is another question completely. But I think conceptually, it sounds like something that I think as an institution would be really interesting to explore a bit more. I think the other thing I would highlight is that I think for many of us, we've found the discussion around illicit financial flows to be a type of delay tactic to some degree, and I say this because I think as you reflected in the clip, right, that was just shown, and also you reiterated, Alex, this conversation is happening within the UN, right? And I think the UN previously adopted a definition for IFFs. And so I think for many African country negotiators, I think trying to open that conversation feels like it's time being taken away from addressing now the serious systemic and structural issues that underpin this. And I think that needs to be really, really called out. I know many negotiators have done so in the room, but I think given the limited time frame that we have to negotiate this convention, I think a lot more time now needs to go into some of these other details we've been having conversations about, and the definitional one really be seen as something that was collectively agreed prior, right, even to these negotiations.
Thanks, Chennai. Jamal, would you like to, is there anything you'd like to pick up or respond to, just elaborate on before we turn to some questions?
Yes. No, I agree actually with Chennai. I think you see there are two proposals here. One in terms of the repatriative justice, and the other one is in terms of the global asset registry. I think in my response, there is, I think there is a need in terms of some discussions, even within the African institutions, on the balance between terms of strategy and tactics. Yeah, I think that what we are saying, and Alex mentioned that, we don't want to overload the text with details, because I think this is like a trick, from developed countries, is that you can get too much into details and then you lose the essence of the of the convention, because it should just lead us in terms of things that we want to do again. But I'm just thinking loudly. I think I don't have an answer on this, but this is what I think, Alex and Chennai and Liz and all of us. There is a danger if we go too far on this, because I think we need, yes, we don't need something, don't to go too details, but we need to get one or two things that are very, very important. And I think what you are saying here is this one of these two very important things that African developed countries should push for, but it needs some sort of a discussion. The issue of the repatriative justice, I think this can be linked to the African Union theme of last year. So it shouldn't be just, you look at it in terms of just the IFF. But as I said earlier, illicit financial flows is a development issue. So if you are thinking about it in terms of the development issues, it should be there, and probably with one or two things. The issue of the global asset registry, it was discussed before, if you remember, in terms of the Mbeki Panel or so, and some people were saying that probably there's no time for this. But I think we should have a discussion now, but this discussion should be, we should have, Chennai, some sort of a discussion within the Africa group and us and ATAF and the African Union and etc. And then a discussion again with Alex, with South Center and so. So, but my in a nutshell, we should not get into this trap of either we have something very, very broad because we don't want to be bogged down in terms of the details and draining the process, or the other thing is we don't push for one or two major things. But what are the one or two? This I think needs some discussion. I don't know if because I was thinking on my feet. I don't know whether I was very clear, because I think this is like a brainstorming, and I didn't think about it, to be honest, until I was responding to Alex. Sorry if I wasn't very coherent.
No, I mean, and that's exactly what we hope from you know, haven't got final solutions here, but I think that's kind of part of the discussion, is to throw out these ideas and think about them and come back together. I'm going to, because we've got about 6 minutes left, and we just want to use, while the interpreters are still with us, there are some questions. I think the first couple maybe for you, Jamal. One which says that you mentioned we need a new AIA system, and why doesn't the current system work? The current system, yeah. And then a second question, which was just if you could explain a little bit more about incorporating IFFs in the development agenda. Why you mean that Nigeria and other countries have succeeded? Just a bit more detail. And what do other countries have to do to get this going? I don't know if you can try and address those, Jamal.
Yes, very quickly. I think you see for the second one, I think the question talked about two things: the development aspect of this and the issue of the asset recovery. Because when I referred to Nigeria, that was based on the asset recovery thing. So I think it's because if you look at the experience of the high-level panel, when we said illicit financial flows is a development issue, and then you have the measurement that was reflected in Addis Ababa agenda, and then in terms of the SDG 16.4 point. Now we have 5 years, and I think we need to start thinking about what's actually beyond Agenda 2030. In terms of, and for us, in terms of ECA now, illicit financial flows actually are part of all of our work. You see, if you look at DRM now, it's not just taxation, tax administration, tax policy or so, it's a leakage is there. We link this to what she and I are saying in terms of the debt and the debt architecture and the fiscal space, etc. Yeah? In terms of Africa now, there's something that probably I did not mention before. There are two main issues which we hope that it can be taken up in the convention and beyond. One is the issue of the natural resources, illicit financial flows, and most of our countries' natural resources, and the issue of cross-border investment. So we hope, these things, we think about illicit financial flows in a development, how it affects development. And so then the issue of asset recovery, it's a very big issue now for us. Nigeria actually managed to get some money back. There are some, as I said, there are no ambassadors for this, but there is one issue, which is, I think we cannot do this in terms of just some countries' initiatives. There is a proposal of an escrow account, and I don't know whether some of the participants know about this. If we really need to retain the money, and there was a proposal, the FACTI panel, is that a development bank, such as the African Development Bank, establish an escrow account during the negotiations. These are very long negotiations. African countries, they don't have the capacity in terms of negotiation, in terms of lawyers and accountants, etc., etc. So what I was saying is that it's not an issue for countries that they should fight it alone. It's a regional issue and it's a global issue. We need some sort of commitment, as my colleague said, in terms of retaining these assets. So this is in a nutshell. I don't want to speak a lot because I think we only have 4 minutes left, and so I want to leave the rest to my colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Jamal. Chenai, There's another, I mean, feel free to respond to those questions, but there's a question, I think, about the multilateral organizations having failed African countries. Can this be fixed? Do we see a multilateral organization could do a better job?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if multilateral organizations could have done a good job, then we would have seen that already, right? It's the inability of the current institutions that exist to address the problem of IFFs and obviously subsequent implications they have on African countries, that's resulted in the Africa Group tabling this proposal at the UN. In fact, there's a document that I was reading that came out of a extraordinary subcommittee meeting on tax and IFFs that had been organized by one of the specialized technical committees at the Africa Union, where they explicitly make reference to the failure of the international financial architecture, the global tax governance system, as being the reason why they now need to find an alternative response. So I think my answer to that would be, if they could have worked, they would have, and their failure to do so has resulted in why we're having this conversation now, and the need for solutions to IFFs, etc., is much more urgent. Maybe just as my passing comment, just because I can see we're at time, there's a question around how or even why, right, would you include IFFs within a developmental agenda, right? And to what extent are African countries doing that? I think for me, part of the reason I am so deeply passionate about the discussion on IFFs is because IFFs are resources that at one time did already exist within African economies, right? So we spend a lot of time often talking about expanding the tax base or increasing tax rates, etc., in order to obviously try and meet a certain tax to GDP ratio. But one of the easiest ways to raise the resources that we need to support domestic revenue mobilization is to retain the resources that we already at some point have within our borders, right? When you look at some of the estimates around IFFs, we are losing so much more than we're receiving, right? In terms of ODA or FDI. And so for me, the extent to which we can really promote progressive tax systems that aren't unfairly burdening particularly, marginalized ordinary citizens, and making sure that wealthy individuals, MNCs, are paying their fair share, is by solutions that help address the IFF question, right? And unfortunately, the reason it hasn't received as much as global political support is that there are other countries that benefit, right, from these resources that are flowing out. But it is so important, particularly developing countries, keep their foot on the pedal, right, to ensure that this issue is addressed, because it's one of the main ways we'll achieve their developmental priorities. Alex made a really, really great presentation showing, for example, how many nurses could have been employed, etc. But I think it's important to know, right, that the loss of some of these investments also has multiplier effects, right? The number of nurses that we weren't able to employ, for example, in year X, has implications on the disease burden in the future, right? Has implications on labor, on health, etc. It is a deeply, deeply concerning issue that I think must be prioritized. And in the work that we've been doing on the continent, have seen many African countries try and begin to incorporate that into their developmental agenda.
Thank you, Chennai. Thank you. I am conscious we've run over a little bit of time, and I just wanted, and there are questions in the Q&A, but I'm wondering whether some of those questions, we certainly, if people want to get in touch with us, we can try and answer them. They won't be Chennai's answer or Jamal's answer, but if there are sort of points that we can pick up, I'm very happy to do that. I'm very conscious that Jamal and Chennai are very busy. Well, and Alex too, obviously, is busy. So I think we'll leave it there. I did want to just, well, first of all, to Chennai, Jamal, Alex, thank you so much for giving us such a rich and broad kind of scope of what IFFs means, what it means in the convention, what might we think about as we approach the August sessions as civil society others. I think that's really, really helpful for us to set the scene for there, particularly on Article 7. We are going to put these webinars, not just this one, but the ones from last week, on YouTube on our website, so you can look at them again, interrogate some of the views and the thoughts, and we'd be very pleased to hear from any observations, comments, or questions you had. Jamal, I see you've got your hand up as a
Yes, I just want to say that I put in the chat an announcement, is that the African Union and ECA are organizing on the 1st and 2nd July a regional consultation on the implementation of FFD4. Chennai knows about this, and it includes, sessions on IFF, UN tax conventions also. We will announce the program soon, but probably some of the participants here, would like to join us. So this is just an announcement. I put it on the chat.
Thank you so much, Jamal. Thank you for doing that. There is a question, and particularly for Jamal and Alex, whether you're happy to share your presentations, and if you are, we can facilitate that. So apologies for those who we haven't been able to answer your questions. Thank you for coming and joining us and listening to this excellent set of presentations. Chennai, Jamal, Alex, thanks very much. Goodbye, everyone.